Welcome. My name is Matt, and let me start by apologizing sincerely that you were made to wait quite so long for your consultation today. We are very busy. Our waiting lists can extend up to a year in some cases. We were able to get you in on a cancellation, and the idea for us as an establishment, as a coffee and a tea house, is to try and convey at least some of the passion that we have for some of the most full-bodied, richest coffees, some of the sweetest and subtleties in the world. Now, as you will already be aware, but perhaps it's good to reiterate, we'll be going through the coffee, taking you through some of its origins, trying to explain and detangle some of the common misconceptions and some of the, quite frankly, some of the off-putting and a little bit overwhelming complications that come with coffee and tea. Some people still feel intimidated in a conversation about coffee. You have these self-professed coffee connoisseurs that quite honestly couldn't tell you an Arabic from a Colombian blend. The purpose of our meeting today is to enjoy and to savor sensation. Drinking coffee is more than just a hot beverage to quench your thirst or to warm you up. Coffee and tea have become the cornerstone of households all throughout the world. And the demographics in both are really quite different. We will start with coffee. Again, we'll go through a tasting. I'll explain the brewing methods, what roasting exactly entails, and we'll go through a tasting of, I haven't decided yet, I'm thinking maybe an Ethiopian blend, a natural Ethiopian blend, but we'll see. The coffee will be accompanied with some very bitter, but wholly delicious dark chocolate. Typically, our dark chocolate ranges between 75 to 90% cacao. Depending on your taste buds and the flavor profile that you enjoy, we'll be tailoring the experience to suit. Okay? Now, you might not be aware of this, but a very large portion of at least our one-on-one consultations, people are coming to see us because of our infamous tea blend. Now, our tea blends are exclusive to Coffee and Tea Articulate. It couldn't be found anywhere else in the world. We'll get into that. Again, welcome. Please do get comfortable. Sit back and relax. All right. Now, let's start with coffee. What is coffee? This might surprise you, but coffee, this is a Davidoff. I think it's a Davidoff 757. And I was looking this out just as you arrived. Now, the Davidoff 57, it's a full-bodied Arabic blend. And what on earth does that mean? It's Arabic, it's full-bodied, it's high intensity, and it's deeply roasted. What are we talking about? What are we talking about? Arabic just means it's of a region, an Arabic region. Okay? And before we go any further than that, all coffee comes from the same plant. And the same as can be said for tea, actually, and people get a little bit confused with this. The only differentiating factor in coffee is where it's grown. And this has a huge, huge, huge impact on the flavor profile the seed or the stone will produce. If you were to take a coffee plant and plant it in somewhere like Indonesia, maybe. Indonesia is famed for growing coffee at low altitudes. If your coffee is at low altitude, oxygen is plentiful. The plant grows very quickly, and somewhere like Indonesia is ideal. I think Starbucks have almost all of their beans grown exclusively in Indonesia because it's perfect for a fast turnaround. The plant grows very quickly and keeping you in supply of an enormous amount of coffee beans. Whereas if you were in somewhere like Ethiopia, very mountainous, and people tend to grow coffee in the mountains where the altitude and therefore oxygen is far less. When coffee plants are at high altitude, similar way to human beings, they have to find a different way for oxygen because it isn't as available. Now, obviously, plants generally give oxygen off as a byproduct, but what is available to them is minimalized, and therefore the process and ultimately the bean entirely changes. You would find something like a much more acidic based bean coming from Ethiopia, whereas in Colombia you would find it's a lot more bitter, far more bitter. That's why you find places like Costa, Starbucks, their coffee can be quite bitey because a lot of them are taken from Indonesia. Now, we've spoken a little bit of what a coffee bean is. I think before we go any further, we should have a bit of a sample. So, what I've prepared for you is a V60 Pour-Over. What is a pour-over, you might wonder? There are different ways to brew coffee. We'll get on to roasting, and we'll explain a little bit more about the coffee bean itself. But before we drink, I think it's good to have an understanding of the brewing process and how even that can impact what it is you're going to taste. So in coffee, we can brew, I think perhaps the most well-known is a French press. It's a little machine with the push down. Now a French press is completely exposing the water to the coffee grounds. When you're exposing it in that way, it's allowed to sit, transfuse, and the water absorbs all of the coffee's flavor. Anything really that is soluble, the coffee will dissolve, or what is soluble at least, and take that into the water. And when it's pressed down, again, you're squeezing the remnants out. Squeezing. And what you're left with is a very full-bodied coffee. A coffee that has captured all of the elements of the bean and presented it perfectly. It's quite bitter. Again, it is full-bodied. When we say full-bodied, we mean it's very, very strong, essentially. The polar opposite to that is something like a Chemex or a V60. And it's the V60 we're going to sample today. Now, do you drink coffee before coming to our little consultation? Okay. Are you more of a full body type or are you more of a subtle? Yeah, okay. And if you know much about acidity and roasting, okay. I'll go into a bit more detail on roasting later, but essentially roasting dictates how strong the coffee is. You can go from something like a cinnamon roast, which is a very, very light toasting of the coffee bean, right up to something like a Spanish roast, which is it's about 6-7 on your roasting meter and is very, very strong. A lot of your house roasts. Me, I tend to middle. A light roast is nice for me. A nice, lightly roasted Ethiopian blend is perfect. Okay. What I'm going to suggest we try is the Ethiopian. We'll get into washing and the processing of the bean a little bit later. There's a lot to cover, but don't worry. We're here to learn. We're here to sample deliciousness. Okay, now let me just prepare our pour over. Now, the pour over or Chemex, they're very similar approaches. Chemex is using more of a very thin filtration and a cone, and you're running water through it. V60 is a similar fashion, but the V60 they'll bring that along for us. Obviously, it's freshly brewed. And I'll explain exactly what a V60 pour-over is. We explained the French press, where you're maximizing the contact of water with the grounds, coffee grounds. A Chemex and V60 pour-over is far more subtle and provides a more delicate drink as far as I'm concerned. I am a little bit biased, but we like what we like. And that's an important thing to remember where coffee is concerned, that there isn't one correct way of doing something, because we all have different taste buds. We all have different preferences. But the V60, it's minimizing the contact the water has with the coffee. So we have a coffee filter, and we're just literally running water through it, running really hot water through it. So the contact with the bean is quite minimal, and then the water's captured in a little basin at the bottom. Now what this is doing is only taking the most immediately soluble attributes of the coffee bean. And what this provides, and what it culminates in, is a beautiful, it's a very delicate, almost aromatic coffee. It's missing that kind of that deep kind of rich black color. It's a little more of a dark kind of brown. It doesn't have that depth to it, but the flavor, for me, a lot of the characteristics of the bean are retained in a Chemex and a V60 pour-over. Thank you. This is our V60 pour-over. You'll notice again it's more like it's a dark brown as opposed to the coffee black that we're perhaps used to. And of course, since you are exceptionally handsome, now that you can hear it, that is a beautiful cup of coffee. Here, would you like sugar or cream perhaps? Okay, wonderful. Now, of course, I'm drinking from the very same cup, even if I'm not quite as handsome. Immediately you're met with a very subtle fruity undertone. No bitterness. So the Ethiopian blends, especially through V60 and Chemex, absolutely beautiful. Subtle, but fulfilling in their own way. I would cheers you, but apparently it's bad luck to cheers without an alcoholic beverage. So I'll wish you well and really savor every single characteristic. And for me, I have a sweet tooth, but the Ethiopian blends I can actually drink without sugar, which for me says quite a lot. Now, I mentioned prior about the processing of the bean. And maybe you didn't know this, but a coffee bean is essentially the seed or the stone of a cherry. Is a little fruit, a cherry. Not the glazed cherries you're used to buying in the supermarket, but it literally is the seed, the stone inside. They're extracted, depending on the process, and left to dry. Now, there are more, but typically two approaches to this. I know, it's beautiful. You can have what's called a natural approach. And a natural is essentially the cherries are allowed to fall off the trees, plants, and literally just left to dry on the ground. And this natural drying out process, it's almost taking it's oxidizing essentially, and there's a bacteria inside the seed, inside the fruit. The fruit will eventually just drop off and be removed, and the bean is left to absorb a lot of the sweetness of the fruit itself. And I said the bean is left to dry, and they're usually left in the fields to dry for about 20 to 30 days if it's a natural approach. And again, the difference or the alternative to this is what's called washing, and probably the most common. Washing is when you take the cherries and you put them into a giant hopper, and literally with water they're just rinsed clean. The husk and the fruit is washed away from the seed or the bean, and the bean is then returned to the field and just left to dry for between 30 to 40 days. It's got a longer drying time than the natural approach because you're introducing a lot of water. Now, for me, I think the natural process, it has a more complex flavor to it because it's absorbing a lot of those sugars from the actual fruit itself, whereas when you're washing it away, the bean, you're left with nothing really but the bean. And the bean can be very tasty, can have a lot of very desirable traits in it. But that's the difference between the two processes. I usually opt for natural, but I do like a washed Kenyan blend, for example. Now, we're about halfway through the coffee. We introduce the bitter. Please help yourself. Now, I've opted for the 90% because given the nature of our Ethiopian blend, it's all acidity. Even though it doesn't taste acidity, it is. A lack of bitterness means a presence of acidity in coffee. Try this. there's a creaminess after maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I drink. Those two flavors combined, that's how there's so many cappuccino flavored or coffee flavored chocolates in the world. These two flavors just seem to blend seamlessly. There's something about coffee and chocolate that our minds, body, taste buds, our brains just seem to resonate with. Of course, please take another bite. It is absolutely beautiful, I must say. I always dreamed as a kid that I'd have a job one day that I would enjoy. Being able to offer these delicacies, a richness in the taste to our customers. Especially so in these one-on-one consultations, where freedom is utmost. You can ask any concern you have over coffee or tea or anything you've always wanted to know but been unsure. And been, again, quite honestly, afraid to ask. We live in a very judgmental society, unfortunately. And there's no judgment here. As long as you come to us well-intended, then the same will be returned. That really quite beautiful. Which, of course, is our absolute minimum of a standard here at Coffee and Tea Articulate. How did you find the Ethiopian blend? Really? Well, it's great to hear. Again, not entirely unsurprising, but positive feedback is, it doesn't get dull with hearing it often enough. Okay. I think we're about ready to move on to some tea. Now, I'll just give you a little glass of water to try and cleanse the palate. And if you spend any time around me, you'll know that's my mantra, cleansing the palate. Just bear with us 2 seconds. Now, tea, the cornerstone of Great Britain. This might surprise you, but tea is actually more popular than coffee and is the second most consumed liquid on the planet, only next to water, which, as far as I'm concerned, means it's the most popular drink. There are many countries that are very fond of tea. Turkey is an example. Great Britain and also Ireland are huge lovers. But the history of tea is really quite interesting, and again, Great Britain stands at the very center of tea, and it's mentioning through history. In fact, in around 1950, 1/3 of all tea in the entire world was sold via the London Tea Exchange. The Britons are mad for their tea, and while black tea is by far and away the most prominent kind of tea in somewhere like Britain, there are actually 4 main tea types. Actually, there's 5. We won't count pour because it's a fermented tea that I don't think it's considered mainstream. But before we even go any further than that, tea all comes from the same plant, this might again surprise you a little bit. Camellia sinensis. Camellia sinensis. That's the name of the plant where all tea leaves in the world come from Camellia sinensis. If it isn't Camellia sinensis, you're not drinking tea, you're drinking a tisane. It's a little tip for you there. Now, the 4 types that I mentioned, we have white tea, black tea, oolong, and green tea. Again, black tea is by far and away the most popular in Great Britain, and Great Britain has always had a fascination and a very deep connection with tea, not only via the London Tea Exchange, but it was the Lady Bedford that brought us afternoon tea. I think in around 1760, maybe 1750. She was a little bit peckish between lunch and dinner, the second and third meal of the day, and she decided, maybe we could have a spot of tea and some cakes. And so the great British tradition of the afternoon tea was born. Lady Bedford. We have her to thank for, again, another cornerstone in British history. Now, before we go any further, I think we should wet the whistle a little bit. And there are some very well established rules when consuming and preparing tea. For example, the teapot. The teapot for brewing tea should always be porcelain or china and white. And again, the reason for this is because of the flavor produced by a white teapot as opposed to a red teapot, as an example. Subtle changes, but there would absolutely be a difference. Next, just because something is in a tea bag doesn't mean it's any less tasty or less impressive than tea leaves. Just simply brewing tea leaves. Some people are a little bit condescending and a little bit judgmental when they see people drinking tea from a tea bag and talking about how much they enjoy it. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Free tea leaves. There's very little difference from tea in a tea bag. And we've been brewing tea from tea bags since about 1889, I think. There's a little bit of contention about who invented the tea bag, but there's a patent submitted by 2 ladies, I think in 1889, although it's attributed to an American gentleman, I think in the early 20th century. But regardless, we're not here to worry about that kind of thing. What we are here to do is to sample some delicious tea, our own exclusively grown tea. It's a black tea. It's gentle. There's no acidity. It's welcoming. And more than that, it's comforting. Regardless of where you are in the world, no nation responds to bad news the way the Brits do. If you were in America and you received some bad news, maybe you were at home and you found out you're losing your job, you found out you failed an exam, your response would be predictable and very typical. You'd be worried, feel anxious, maybe you pace up and down. In Britain, there's only one response to bad news in the household, and that is put on the kettle. Let's have a cuppa. Having a cuppa is, again, the very center of the British household, and as a Brit myself, something I'm very, very proud of. Tea is a beautiful drink. It's full of antioxidants. It's comforting to drink and it tastes wonderful. But I think before we run out of time, let's get some tea drunk. Use a white teapot. Second rule, make sure your water isn't hard. Hard water tends to leave a scummy, kind of scummy chemical trail at the top of your cup. You don't want hard water. Second rule, learning to steep. This is a fresh tea bag, one of our own design. I said the leaves and plants are grown exclusively for us. Water should always be boiling, 100 degrees, nothing less. You might find that when you're on a plane, tea has a way of tasting unpleasant or not like tea. It's because water boils at a much lower temperature in the air because of the pressure in the cabin. And unless tea is allowed to brew and infuse with boiled water, it isn't going to taste the same. You lose a lot of the tea's characteristics. Let's pop this in. And typically with a pot of tea, as large as this, you want 3, maybe even 4 tea bags. I'm going to use 3 because I don't like tea as strong as some people. Okay. My towel trying to escape there. Some boiling hot water. Tea bags 2 and 3. Good. Now, some people will rock their teapot. Personally, I think this is unnecessary. Unless you're in a hurry, of course. But I mentioned the word steeping earlier. Myself included, I'm guilty of boiling my kettle, getting my tea bag, pouring it in the cup, pouring the water, stirring, squeezing, taking the tea bag out, adding some splash of milk, whatever kind of milk, coconut, cows, doesn't matter. And you're done. The rule to steeping is a minimum of 4 minutes, up to and ideally 6 minutes steeping time. Now, if you were to add your tea bag to your water, stir, squeeze, remove it, compared to a 6-minute steep, your tea will be a lot stronger, but the flavor that comes with it is so much more intense. And I don't just mean it's a strong flavor, I mean the characteristics of the profile are far more complex. You're grabbing all of the tea's attributes over the 6 minutes instead of just the ready soluble. Okay? There really is a mountain of difference between a 2-minute steep and a 4 to 6 minute. Not to mention the amount of caffeine. Caffeine will probably be doubled, as well as the antioxidants. You're literally doubling the amount in the tea, letting it steep for the recommended time. And the recommended time hasn't come from myself. It actually comes from the British Industry of Standards. Yes, the British have a set of standards for preparing tea in the most optimal way. That's what it means to be British. Now, to accompany our tea, we have some fresh oat and golden syrup cookies. Now, these are more commonly known as hobnobs in Great Britain. I can smell the oats and the sweetness. These only came out the oven maybe 10 minutes ago. Honestly, smell them. Isn't that the most beautiful thing? going to accompany our tea marvelously. Now, I mentioned your teapot has to be white china porcelain. Well, this isn't as essential. The cup, I'd make the same recommendation. Now, you may have seen the English especially are known for this posh pinky. Posh pinky. The Queen of England drinks her tea a lot like this. And the raise of the pinky is meant to denote class and standing. Needless to say, I never use them. I drink tea in whatever way is comfortable for me to drink. It's simple as that. Now, tea itself, it's said to have originated from China. Whenever there's a date that's this old, it has to be queried at least, or seen with skepticism. 2737 BC. Okay, that is a long time ago, and it was the Emperor Shen Nuing who is said to have been sat under a tree, not unlike Sir Isaac Newton, and some leaves fell from the tree and landed in his hot water. He just happened to be drinking hot water at the time. As you can see, I have a little bit of skepticism with the story, but that's the origins of tea. That's where it came from. It changed the color of his water. He decided to drink it, not worrying about it being poisonous in any way. And so that bore an entire industry of tea growing. And I said, here we are now as the second most consumed liquid on the entire planet. Now, your tea. That is a perfect color for a black tea. Here, if you like some sugar, some milk, just let me know, okay? I'll pour myself a cup. Cheers. You shouldn't really cheers with an alcoholic beverage. It's the very meaning of being British. And I encourage anybody to try tea. It's relatively affordable, it's natural, and it's delicious. Please do try one of our cookies. Hop, nop. Thank you. The perfect crunch, an immediate sweetness that complements the tea. Effortlessly. Now, unfortunately, this is all we have time for, but of course, please finish your tea. Eat as many biscuits as you like. And let me tell you that it's been my absolute pleasure for you to join me today. No, it really is. The pleasure is all mine. I am Matt, and I want to thank you for giving up your time today. Okay? And I'll see you soon.